In 1917, Europe's royal families were learning that a crown could disappear almost overnight. Russia's Nicholas II had been forced from his throne. Germany's Kaiser would soon flee into exile. The Habsburg Emperor was about to lose an empire that had ruled Central Europe for centuries. The Ottoman Sultanate was sliding toward its own end. Yet in London, another monarch from that same web of royal cousins was still on his throne. King George V didn't survive because Britain was somehow spared the forces tearing down the others. Britain had mass casualties, labor unrest, Irish rebellion, and a population growing less willing to be ruled from above. Over the following decades, the empire itself came apart around him. But the monarchy stayed. That's the real puzzle. Britain didn't preserve its royal family by preserving the old world. It preserved the royal family by letting the old world change around it. Again and again, the crown gave up political ground, changed its public identity, distanced itself from unpopular power, and accepted that sometimes a king, a title, even an empire, had to be sacrificed so the institution itself could go on. This isn't really a story about a monarchy that refused to fall. It's a story about one that learned how to bend. To understand why, we need to go back before the great imperial collapses, to a moment when Britain's monarchy had already begun surrendering the very thing that made other monarchies so vulnerable: direct political control. By the 19th century, the British crown was ancient and still powerful in ways that mattered, but it was no longer an absolute monarchy. That break had come long before Queen Victoria, through civil war, revolution, the settlement of 1688 and 1689, and the steady growth of Parliament. A monarch could still influence politics, appoint a prime minister, shape the tone of government. But the direction of travel was clear. Taxation, legislation, political legitimacy, all of it was moving toward Parliament. That shift mattered even more in the age of mass politics. When Victoria came to the throne in 1837, Britain was changing fast. The Reform Act of 1832 had already widened political representation, though the vote was still far from democratic by modern standards. More reform followed. New voters entered politics. Newspapers reached bigger audiences. Industrial cities grew. Political parties organized. Public opinion got harder to ignore. Victoria was trained to operate inside that system. She had very few direct powers, but she could still use influence. The monarch could advise. The monarch could warn. The monarch could encourage. What she increasingly could not do was rule against the political nation and expect obedience. That made the British system look weaker than the great continental empires, and in one sense it was. The Kaiser in Germany, the Tsar in Russia, the Habsburg Emperor in Austria-Hungary all stood much closer to the machinery of government, the military, the political order itself. Their personal authority was visible. But visibility created danger. When government failed, the ruler could become the failure. When the army lost, the dynasty could be blamed. When people demanded constitutional change, the monarch could look like the obstacle standing in front of it. Britain's crown slowly moved somewhere else. As elected politics expanded, governments became easier to replace without replacing the monarchy. Prime minister could fall. Party could lose an election. A law could change. The crown could stay above the immediate defeat. None of this was clean or peaceful. Britain had class conflict, violent protest, colonial repression, deep inequality, recurring constitutional crises, and the royal family wasn't always politically neutral in the modern sense. Victoria had strong opinions and sometimes clashed with her ministers. But the long-term drift was unmistakable. The monarchy was becoming less like the government and more like the symbol standing behind it. At the same time, Victoria and Prince Albert were building another source of strength: the idea of the royal family itself. Royalty was no longer presented only through crowns, uniforms, and inherited rank. It was shown through marriage, children, domestic life, mourning, charity, ceremony, family photographs. The sovereign was still distant, but the dynasty was increasingly a household the public could recognize. That image became especially powerful sitting beside imperial spectacle. In 1876, Victoria took the title Empress of India. By her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, colonial prime ministers joined the celebrations, and imperial troops helped turn the event into a display of global reach. It looked like the triumph of monarchy and empire together. But underneath the spectacle, the monarchy's survival was already becoming less dependent on empire than it appeared. The crown's political power at home had narrowed even as its ceremonial presence grew larger. That was the paradox. The less directly the monarch governed, the easier it became for the monarchy to represent continuity without owning responsibility for every decision made in its name. The next test came under Victoria's grandson, George V. He became king in 1910, right in the middle of a serious constitutional fight. The elected Liberal government was battling the conservative-dominated House of Lords after the Lords rejected the people's budget. The argument wasn't just about taxation. It was about who ultimately had the right to govern. The crisis reached the crown because the government considered asking the king to create enough new peers to break the Lords' resistance if necessary. George hated the position. Any move risked making him look partisan. Refuse the ministers, and the monarchy looks like it's fighting an elected government. Accept their advice, and he transforms the House of Lords with his own signature. The Parliament Act of 1911 eventually reduced the Lords' power to block legislation. The detail matters less than the pattern. At a moment when the crown might have tried to defend the old aristocratic order, the system moved the other way. Parliamentary government got stronger. The monarchy stayed exactly where it was. That became one of the central rules of British royal survival. When the political structure had to change, the crown usually survived by refusing to be the final barrier to change. Then came the First World War. This is where the difference between Britain and the old imperial monarchies turned brutal. Europe's rulers were related by blood, but their countries were killing each other on an industrial scale. George V was first cousin to both Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Family resemblance offered no protection. Dynastic diplomacy had failed completely. For the British royal family, the war created a dangerous identity problem. George's dynasty was officially the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a German name inherited through Prince Albert. Other members of the extended family carried German titles. In a Europe where royal families had married across borders for generations, this had once seemed unremarkable. Now German names sounded poisonous. Anti-German feelings surged through Britain. Businesses changed their names. Families with German ancestry faced open suspicion. Even a royal household couldn't assume tradition would protect it. George responded with one of the most successful rebrandings in modern royal history. In 1917, he replaced the family name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha with Windsor, after the castle. It's easy to dismiss the change as cosmetic. It wasn't. A dynasty looked at its own identity and decided that centuries of family connection mattered less than public acceptance in the country it ruled. German titles were abandoned or reshaped. The royal house presented itself as unmistakably British. The monarchy had changed its label because the nation around it had changed its emotional expectations. And it happened at almost the exact moment another cousin's monarchy collapsed. In March 1917, revolution forced Nicholas II to abdicate in Russia. At first, the British government was willing to consider asylum for Nicholas and his family. But the plan turned politically dangerous fast. The Russian former emperor wasn't simply George's cousin. He was a symbol of autocracy at a moment when wartime hardship and social tension were already running high in Britain. Records from the period show George grew concerned about the political fallout of bringing the Romanovs to Britain, and pressed for the matter to be reconsidered. That episode has stayed controversial ever since, partly because Nicholas and his family were later murdered by the Bolsheviks. But it also reveals something cold and important about royal survival. The British crown couldn't behave only like a family. It had to behave like an institution. George could feel personal loyalty toward Nicholas and still fear what a deposed autocrat's presence might do to his own monarchy. Private blood ties and public survival were pulling in opposite directions. By the end of the war, that distinction had become brutally clear. The Romanovs were gone. The German Empire had collapsed, and Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to the Netherlands. Austria-Hungary broke apart, ending Habsburg rule over a vast collection of peoples. Other monarchies were shaken, overthrown, transformed. Britain's monarchy remained. Not every monarchy in Europe disappeared, of course. The Scandinavian kingdoms, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and other continuing or restored monarchies survived in different forms. This isn't literally a story of every crown vanishing except Britain's. The more useful comparison is with the great imperial dynasties, the ones whose rulers were bound tightly to the political and military systems that collapsed around them. George survived because his monarchy had already stopped trying to be that kind of monarchy. During the war, he also made the crown visible in a different way, visiting troops, hospitals, factories, wounded servicemen. Public service was becoming the royal family's function. That wasn't just compassion. It was constitutional evolution turned into theater. A monarch who could no longer claim the right to rule personally could still claim the duty to serve publicly. After the war, that mattered even more, because Britain wasn't returning to the old world. Millions of men had served. Women had taken on new economic roles and won political rights. Labor politics was growing. Ireland was moving toward separation. The empire was shifting. The electorate had grown enormous. A monarchy built only for aristocrats couldn't survive in a mass democracy. Ireland offered an especially hard test of that. The island had seen rebellion, guerrilla war, reprisals, bitter division. In June 1921, George opened the new Parliament of Northern Ireland in Belfast and used the occasion to appeal for reconciliation between Irish people and between Ireland and Britain. He didn't solve the conflict. Partition remained. Violence continued. The settlement that followed was shaped by negotiation, armed struggle, and decisions far beyond the king's control. But the episode showed how the crown's role had changed. George was most useful not when he commanded policy, but when he could speak in a register party politicians couldn't easily use. Later that year, supporters of the Anglo-Irish settlement pointed back to the Belfast speech in parliamentary debate as part of what moved things toward negotiation. That was a new kind of royal power, not the power to impose peace, the power to make compromise look compatible with continuity. For a monarchy trying to survive the democratic age, that distinction was invaluable. So the crown widened the story it told about itself. George V received labor governments without treating them as an existential threat to the throne. He appeared at national commemorations. He tied the monarchy to wartime sacrifice and public mourning. The cenotaph, military cemeteries, remembrance ceremonies, royal visits, all of it helped place the monarch inside a shared national culture that crossed party lines. Again, the key was distance from day-to-day politics. The king still had constitutional influence. He still held private audiences. In moments of uncertainty, politicians could seek his advice. But the institution's survival increasingly depended on the public believing the crown belonged to the country, not to one political faction. At the same time, something remarkable was happening to the empire. Britain was starting to loosen control over some of its most important self-governing dominions without giving up the crown as the link between them. The Imperial Conference of 1926 described Britain and the dominions as autonomous communities, equal in status. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 gave that legal force, a new relationship of legislative independence for the dominions. This wasn't decolonization in the later sense. Vast parts of the empire remained under direct or unequal British rule. But it created a model that would become central to royal survival. The crown could be divided constitutionally. The same person could be monarch in separate countries, acting through separate governments. That idea was astonishingly flexible. Empire had been built around hierarchy. The new Commonwealth relationship could only survive by accepting equality. The monarchy was learning to live after imperial control before the empire had even finished disappearing. Then, in 1936, the institution faced a crisis that came not from war or revolution, but from the king himself. Edward VIII inherited the throne after George V died. He was charismatic, modern, enormously famous, and determined to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had already been divorced twice. The problem was constitutional, political, religious, and personal all at once. Edward wasn't a private celebrity free to make a romantic choice without consequences. As king, he was head of state and supreme governor of the Church of England. His ministers believed the marriage was unacceptable given the circumstances. The Dominion governments had to be considered too. Edward explored his options. Could he marry Wallis without making her queen? Could public opinion be won over? Could he simply remain king and reject his minister's advice? Every path raised the same question that had destroyed other monarchies. What happens when a monarch's personal will collides with the political system? In Britain, the answer was ruthless. The system won. On December 10, 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. The next day, Parliament gave it legal effect. His brother Albert became George VI. The human drama was extraordinary. A king giving up the throne for the woman he wanted to marry. But the deeper constitutional message mattered even more. Britain had just shown that the monarchy could survive the removal of the monarch. That sounds obvious now. It wasn't obvious inside a system built entirely around hereditary sovereignty. The individual king could be separated from the crown. Edward could leave. The institution carried on through his brother. George VI deliberately chose the same regnal name his father had used. The choice emphasized continuity right after the scandal. Quiet but unmistakable. The crown was larger than the man wearing it. Then came the Second World War, and this time the monarchy's survival strategy turned physical. In 1940, German bombers attacked London. Buckingham Palace itself was hit. On September 13th, bombs struck the palace while the king and queen were inside. A member of staff was killed in the raid. The royal couple didn't retreat from public life. They toured bomb-damaged neighborhoods. They visited factories, troops, hospitals, communities. George VI spoke by radio. Queen Elizabeth became a visible companion in that same public ritual of endurance. This wasn't equality in any material sense. The royal family had protections and resources ordinary Londoners never had. But symbolism matters most when people can actually see the symbol, and a palace with broken windows and bomb damage read very differently from a distant court safely removed from the war. The monarchy's message was that the royal family would stay inside the national emergency. That turned one of the institution's weaknesses into an advantage. A hereditary king couldn't claim democratic legitimacy, but he could claim continuity. He could be present while governments changed. He could stand in uniform while elected politicians argued. He could represent the state without pretending to direct the war. That separation was crucial. Winston Churchill became the dominant political face of British resistance. The government made policy. Military commanders made strategy. Parliament stayed the center of political authority. The king didn't need to win the war personally for the monarchy to benefit from national survival, and that's a sharp contrast with monarchies destroyed by military defeat, where ruler and regime had become inseparable. On Victory in Europe Day in May 1945, crowds gathered around Buckingham Palace, and the royal family appeared again and again on the balcony. The scene looked like a victory for an ancient monarchy. But another empire was already approaching its end. Britain emerged from the war victorious and exhausted, deeply indebted, watching anti-colonial movements grow stronger. The moral language used to fight fascism was hard to reconcile with indefinite imperial rule. India, the empire's most important possession, was moving toward independence. In 1947, British rule in India ended. India and Pakistan became independent states. George VI lost the imperial title tied to India the following year. This could have been the moment the crown bet everything on preserving as much imperial authority as it could. Instead, the institution changed again. India planned to become a republic, which created a constitutional problem. If Commonwealth membership required recognizing the British monarch as head of state, Republican India would have to leave. The London Declaration of 1949 found another way through. India could remain a republic and still stay in the Commonwealth. George VI would be recognized as head of the Commonwealth, not as India's king. That distinction sounds technical. It was revolutionary. The monarchy had once been one of the symbols through which imperial authority was claimed. Now it could become a symbol of voluntary association, even for countries that rejected monarchy altogether. The crown was letting go of power in order to keep the connection. When Elizabeth II came to the throne in 1952, that transformation accelerated. She inherited a monarchy still wrapped in imperial ceremony, but the political map underneath it was changing fast. Colonies across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific moved toward independence. Some new states kept the monarch. Others became republics. Many stayed in the Commonwealth either way. Elizabeth didn't stop decolonization. She couldn't have, not as a constitutional monarch. Those decisions belonged to governments and independence movements, often forged through bitter conflict. But she understood her public role before she ever became queen. On her 21st birthday in 1947, during a tour of South Africa, she made a radio pledge that her life, whether long or short, would be devoted to service. That line became one of the central promises of her reign. The promise mattered because it offered a new justification for hereditary monarchy. The old justification had been birth, divine order, conquest, imperial authority. The modern justification was duty. When her coronation was televised in 1953, millions watched a ceremony earlier generations had experienced mostly through crowds, newspapers, paintings, or newsreels. Ancient ritual walked straight into the living room. Technology could have made monarchy look absurdly old-fashioned. Instead, the palace learned to use broadcasting to make distance feel intimate. Over the following decades, Christmas broadcasts, televised ceremonies, walkabouts, jubilees, investitures, royal tours, all of it turned constitutional restraint into a visible occupation. The sovereign didn't need to make policy to look busy. Public duty itself became the product. Her role was different. She became the human face of continuity while the whole structure around the crown kept changing. That's one of the deepest reasons the monarchy survived the fall of the British Empire. It never insisted that the end of empire had to mean the end of the crown. The monarchy detached itself from imperial sovereignty and attached itself instead to constitutional service, ceremony, diplomacy, and the Commonwealth. None of that transformation was morally clean. The British Empire had been built through conquest, coercion, extraction, racial hierarchy, and settler expansion, as well as trade, administration, and institutional exchange. For millions of people, the crown was never a neutral symbol. It had been invoked in acts of dispossession and colonial rule. Those histories didn't disappear when flags changed. They still shape arguments today over royal tours, historical responsibility, slavery, colonial violence, indigenous sovereignty, reparations, and what the Commonwealth even means. But institutionally, the monarchy gained flexibility by accepting that countries could leave imperial control without the royal family itself having to disappear. The Queen could be sovereign of the United Kingdom and, separately, sovereign of other independent realms. She could be head of the Commonwealth even for republics that didn't recognize her as their own head of state. The old empire had demanded obedience. The new arrangement depended on consent. That difference helped save the crown, and it changed what royal work looked like. Elizabeth's reign became a long performance of continuity, through travel, ceremony, private audiences with prime ministers, state visits, charity patronage, military connections, national mourning, public celebration. The political rule was restraint. The monarch was informed. The monarch advised privately. The monarch warned privately. But the monarch never became a public party politician. That restraint gave the crown a strange advantage in a democracy. People could project almost anything onto it. Conservatives could see tradition. Others could see public service. Some citizens felt real personal affection for the Queen while disliking the institution itself. Commonwealth countries could reinterpret the same crown through their own constitutions. And Republicans could oppose monarchy without ever having to argue the sovereign was personally directing government policy. Political neutrality didn't remove controversy. It just changed where the controversy landed. When governments failed, elections replaced them. When policies turned unpopular, ministers resigned. The crown tried to stay outside the blast radius. But there were limits to that strategy, because the monarchy wasn't only a constitutional office. It was also a family, and families create scandals that constitutions can't control. The 1990s became one of the most dangerous stretches for the modern royal image. Marriages broke down in public. Private conversations became headlines. The press grew more aggressive. The line between royal dignity and celebrity culture got harder and harder to hold. Then Windsor Castle burned in 1992. That same year, the Queen described it publicly as a year she wouldn't remember with undiluted pleasure, using the phrase annus horribilis. The fire became more than a building disaster. It triggered anger over who should pay for the repairs, and at a time when royal finances were already under scrutiny, that question struck straight at the institution's legitimacy. The response followed an old pattern: adapt. From 1993, the monarch began voluntarily paying income tax on personal income, under arrangements agreed with the government. Buckingham Palace opened more widely to paying visitors, helping fund the restoration. The monarchy didn't abolish privilege. It adjusted the terms under which privilege got defended. Then came a far more emotional crisis. Diana, Princess of Wales, died in Paris in August 1997. The public reaction was enormous. Flowers piling up outside royal residences. Crowds gathering, grief that felt intensely personal and modern. The royal family's first response, centered on privacy for Diana's sons at Balmoral, struck many members of the public and press as distant. For an institution that had survived by reading public emotion correctly, this was dangerous. The monarchy changed course. The Queen returned to London and delivered a televised address, speaking not only as sovereign but as a grandmother. The flag over Buckingham Palace became part of a national argument about symbolism. The funeral turned into a vast public event. The episode exposed something new. The monarchy no longer had to survive revolution. It had to survive emotional expectations inside a mass media democracy, where a single week of silence could look like a constitutional crisis even when no law had changed. This is where the British monarchy's survival formula turns almost paradoxical. It survives by being ancient, but it also survives by responding to the present. It sells continuity, but it can't afford to be immovable. It depends on ceremony, but the ceremony has to feel emotionally believable. It claims political neutrality, while its members live in a world where every gesture gets read politically. And because the institution is hereditary, it can't recruit its leaders. It gets whoever's next in line, strengths, weaknesses, and all. That's what makes the 1936 abdication so significant in hindsight. It created a precedent in public memory. The institution can protect itself by cutting a problematic individual loose from the central role. That same instinct has resurfaced in the 21st century. Prince Harry and Meghan stepped back as working royals in 2020. The monarchy didn't collapse. Their departure just got absorbed by reshuffling who carried out official duties. Prince Andrew created a far more damaging problem. Allegations tied to his relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein became a prolonged scandal. Andrew had already withdrawn from public duties years before the latest phase of the controversy broke. Then, in late 2025, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles III had begun a formal process to strip Andrew of his royal style, titles, and honors. Official succession information in 2026 lists him simply as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, though he remains in the line of succession unless Parliament changes the law. The details are modern. The institutional logic is old. The monarchy survives by insisting the crown isn't identical to every member of the family. A prince can be removed from public life. Titles can change. Patronages can be redistributed. The circle of official duty can narrow. The center tries to hold. None of this guarantees the strategy always works, or that the monarchy survives indefinitely. Constitutional monarchies run on public acceptance. If enough people stop seeing value in the institution, tradition alone won't save it. And modern Britain isn't the Britain of George V. The population is more diverse. Deference is weaker. The press environment is relentless. Social media destroys distance. Younger generations often view inherited status more critically. Former colonies and Commonwealth countries keep debating whether the crown even fits their national identity anymore. The institution faces open questions about wealth, transparency, tax exemptions, public funding, and colonial history, and the legal privileges that still surround the crown. Yet the monarchy has one more survival advantage. Much of what looks like royal wealth isn't simply private property a monarch could take and walk away with. The crown estate, for instance, isn't the king's personal property. Its profits go to the treasury, and the sovereign grant that funds royal duties is calculated through rules set by law. Occupied palaces like Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle are held for official use in right of the crown, not owned like ordinary private houses the king could simply sell. At the same time, the monarch and heir do have separate sources of private income, including the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall and personal assets. The distinction matters because the modern monarchy isn't just a wealthy family sitting on an inheritance. It's a legal institution embedded inside the British state. The ceremonies are old, but the finances, the constitutional powers, the succession rules, the public duties, all of it sits inside statute, convention, government advice, and parliamentary authority. Even the most dramatic royal ritual demonstrates this. At the state opening of Parliament, the king sits on a throne and reads the king's speech. It looks like sovereign command, but the government writes the speech. The monarch delivers the elected minister's program. That single image contains the whole survival story. The crown kept the theater of power while surrendering almost all the freedom to use power personally. Other monarchies survived through similar constitutional adaptation, so Britain isn't unique in principle. Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Spain, all show that monarchy can coexist with democracy once political authority is limited and public legitimacy is maintained. But Britain offers one of the most dramatic examples because its royal family survived not only the age that destroyed the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, and the Ottomans, but also the disappearance of the empire so much of its ceremony had once depended on. Today, King Charles III remains sovereign. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, is first in line, followed by his children. The king is sovereign of 14 Commonwealth realms beyond the United Kingdom, while the Commonwealth itself contains 56 independent countries, most of them republics. That sentence alone would have been almost impossible to explain to an imperial courtier at Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The empire is gone. Most Commonwealth countries don't have the British monarch as head of state. India, once the center of Victoria's imperial title, is a republic. Pakistan, once one of the first independent realms of the post-war crown, is a republic. Plenty of countries that once appeared on maps in imperial red now argue among themselves about whether monarchy, republicanism, or the Commonwealth belongs in their future. And yet the royal house at Windsor continues. Not because it defeated history, because it kept accepting history's verdict before that verdict turned fatal. It accepted parliamentary government. It accepted a widening electorate. It accepted that an aristocratic chamber could lose its power. It accepted that a German dynasty could become Windsor. It accepted that a king could abdicate. It accepted that dominions could become equal. It accepted that colonies could become independent. It accepted that former colonies could become republics and still stay partners. It accepted new taxes and financial scrutiny. It accepted that public emotion could force changes in royal behavior. And when scandal threatened the institution, it kept trying to separate the central crown from whichever individual had become the problem. None of those moves was inevitable. Some were reluctant. Some came late. Some followed public anger. Some only happened once the alternative got more dangerous than the change itself. But together, they built a monarchy with an unusual survival instinct. The Romanov system couldn't imagine Russia without the Tsar's authority, until revolution made the decision for it. The German imperial system tied the Kaiser to military prestige, then collapsed in defeat. The Habsburg monarchy was bound to a multinational imperial structure that disintegrated under war, nationalism, and military disaster. The Ottoman dynasty was inseparable from an imperial political order a new Turkish republic deliberately replaced. Britain's royal family took another path. It let the state become less royal without requiring the royal family to disappear. That's the answer hidden inside the title. Britain's monarchy survived because, at the moments that mattered most, survival was treated as more important than control. The crown kept giving things away: power, political choice, imperial authority, family names, personal preference, even kings. And each surrender made the institution a little easier to preserve. There's no guarantee this bargain lasts forever. A monarchy built on public consent can lose that consent. A future crisis might demand an adaptation the institution can't make or won't make in time. But for more than a century, the British royal family has kept escaping the fate of its fallen cousins through the same basic move, making itself less necessary to government and more useful as a symbol. Which brings us back to Windsor. In 1917, George V took the name of a castle and used it to replace a German dynastic identity that had turned politically dangerous. More than 100 years later, Windsor Castle is still a working royal palace. Audiences are held there. Ceremonies take place there. The name still names the royal house. The castle looks like continuity carved in stone. But the dynasty inside it survived through the opposite quality. Change. That might be the strangest truth about Britain's monarchy. Its greatest tradition isn't refusing to move. It's knowing when to move just enough. So which is it, resilience or an institution that's simply gotten very good at postponing its own ending?